Good morning. It's kind of strange standing here because it's made my mind go back to when I was a teenager, and Peggy Mason, those of you that are of my age or older would remember her. She said, "Victor, will you do the missions appeal in Sabbath school?" And I was probably 13 or 14 years old and very, very shy and absolutely terrified. And I came up here with my knees knocking together and did the missions appeal. And I'm still nervous. But even more strange for me was, I'm looking at the back corner there, and that's where my aunt used to sit and my grandma. And I was sitting there with them one Sabbath morning, and Pastor Ron Surridge was conducting a baptism here. Now, I don't know what Stanborough Park Church is like today, but when I was a teenager, it was a very, very proper place. And if somebody stood at the front here and made an appeal, nobody would move a muscle. But I was sitting at the back there, and Pastor Surridge made this appeal, and I had just been involved in a youth outreach program. Those of you that remember, it was in the old tin tabernacle on Stanborough Park. I didn't do anything public because I was far too shy. I did what I still like doing. I switched the lights on and off and did the PA system. I was the Ben of my time back then. And yet somehow being involved in that program changed me. And when Pastor Surridge made an appeal, I found myself rising up out of the pew, and I was beetroot-colored from head to toe. I was so shy and so embarrassed, and yet God did something with me. And within the next couple of months, I was baptized and have gone on an incredible journey. To think that shy 16-year-old boy I was then when I got baptized, then went on to Newbold, and my brother, who does not attend church, in fact, he declares himself to be an atheist, he says to me, "Victor, your parents would be so proud of you if they knew you worked at the Trans-European Division," which I guess is something from an atheist. I'm surprised I'm there. That's more to the point. But the point is that God uses you in His time, at the right moment, and does things with you that you never, ever would expect would happen. In our scripture reading, we read was a few verses later in Ecclesiastes, but the beginning of the chapter says, "There is a time for everything, and a season for every activity under the heavens." And then, you know the passage very well, it goes on and it lists a whole pile of those activities. Somehow we always seem to look at the negative ones, but there's a time to be born. Deanna is due today. But thankfully she's still here. She promised she would stay at least till the end of my sermon. Time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to uproot, a time to kill, and a time to heal, a time to tear down, and a time to build, a time to weep, and a time to laugh, a time to mourn, and a time to dance. And it goes on. And yet, in this modern world, it's kind of designed that we don't have time. You just took up your development fund offering. We could take one up for the Hulbert household. We've been in a process. We've been living in this house, astonishingly, for 19 years. I'm not used to living in a house for more than 4 or 5 years as a minister. And yet somehow we've been living there a long time. And it needs refurbishing. It needs things doing on it. And every spare moment, Louisa and I were working on DIY projects, and somehow in 2017 we managed to conjure up 4 projects at once, and we managed to finish one of them. That's the very last floorboard going down in our living room. We're working on the kitchen. We're working on the downstairs bathroom. We're working on the front garden. But there's always something that needs doing, and we don't have enough time. And then we get so busy doing projects and then looking after the grandchildren and everything else we do there. There's no time. And when we get a day off, the last thing we want to do is developing the Hulbert house. And so we go out and enjoy nature. Those of you that follow me on Facebook know that I like, apart from putting pictures of my grandchildren, I put lots of pictures of nature because we like hiking. I like playing with gadgets as well. And so sometimes when I go out, I have my camera with me, or in the last year, I got a new toy. I got a drone. It still scares me when I fly it. I've not crashed it yet. And I just want you to bear with me for 2 minutes as I play you the first kind of official thing I did with the drone without crashing it. Okay, this is where the computer crashes. No. Let's try again. Oh, there we go. So there you have it. That was just over 2 minutes long. My question to you, and you can see my drone there in the shadow, very cleverly done on purpose. My question to you is, how long did it take to make those 2 minutes? I mean, you sat there, you may have read your Bible for the last 2 minutes, or your mind may have wandered somewhere else, or you may have thought, this isn't quite David Attenborough. But how long did it take to make those 2 minutes? 5 hours? Okay. Yeah, there's a hand up there, shout it out. 2 hours. Okay, it took me about 2 hours to film it. Because there was actually in 2 different bluebell woods around the Newbold area, and I was going very carefully because I didn't want to crash the drone. Then probably took another 4 or 5 hours to edit it and put it together and find the music and put it all there and upload it to social media and all of the things that you do. But you watched it for 2 minutes with all of that work going on behind it. So when you come to something like Blue Planet 2 and you're watching that, well, they tell you at the end of every episode how many months it took them to get a 20-second shot. There's an immense amount of time goes in to doing certain things. And that equally applies to God. He's made everything beautiful in his time. He's also set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. And actually, I'm struck by the last bit of that text somewhat, because I like the beginning bit. He's made everything beautiful in his time, and he has, and that's why I love going out in nature and seeing all of that beauty. That's why I love it when my grandchildren turned up unexpectedly yesterday, and I could get my cuddles. Makes me feel better every time. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. And we start asking questions, and we look at the things that are happening around us. And these are just a very few of the pictures of things from last year, of terrorist tragedies, both in our country and then overseas. You see the BBC one there is actually Adventist Help, an Adventist charity working together with ADRA, helping in Iraq with the crisis there with displaced people. Those people I'm interviewing on the left-hand side there, they are migrants from Nigeria, Ghana, countries like that. And I went down to interview them on World Refugee Sabbath, and I went slightly cynically, because the previous year I had been interviewing Syrian refugees that had crossed over to Greece and were in a terrible state, and I was visiting them in their refugee camps, and I had 120% sympathy for them. And then I was asked to go down to Italy and interview these migrants that had equally had a terrible journey crossing over from Libya on those boats across the Mediterranean to Lampedusa and then up. And I met them at a church in Castel Volturno, a principally immigrant church, an Adventist church, and I started interviewing these people. And as I say, I went slightly cynically because I thought, you've come from Ghana. That's a pretty good country. You've come from Nigeria. There's a lot good that's happening there, and several other countries from Africa as well. And then I started hearing their stories. A girl whose parents were spiritists, but she'd become a Christian. And when her mother died, she was expected to take over her parents' religion. And she said, I not only had to leave my village, I had to leave Nigeria, because if I stayed in the country, they would find me. And she went to Libya, and she was actually working there very successfully and having a good career there. And then the Arab Spring came, and there was civil war in Libya. And suddenly, and everybody I talked to, and a lot of the people there had moved from their countries for economic advantage to go to Libya and were working there successfully. And then when the civil war came, if you were black, suddenly you were no longer welcome. And they told me stories, horrific stories. I'm not going to tell you those stories this morning. And yet the amazing thing is, I met them at this stage in their journey, and for none of them is their journey over yet. But I met them on a Sabbath morning in a church in Italy. They're wearing their best clothes. I asked one of the ladies, I said, you're really well dressed. She said, yes, I get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and I go out searching for the clothes that the party goers have let go the night before, and that's what I'm wearing to church. Gave a couple of them a lift home on the Friday evening when we'd been at the church, and we gave them a lift 6 kilometers, so 4 miles up the road, and when we got to the top of their road, they said, please drop us here. And it was very clear they wanted us to drop them there because they didn't want us to see where they live, because they're still on a journey. And yet the thing for me is that they came to church and they came full of joy. You hear their singing. It is vibrant. They're working at menial jobs. Some of them had a job. There's an ADRA project, which is one of the reasons we went down there. And ADRA was training them in sustainable futures. But a lot of them are just picked up by the roadside in the morning. They're taken to a job. And if they're very lucky, at the end of the day, they get paid. And if they're not, they don't, because you're right in the heart of mafia territory. And life is not easy. And yet, all of those people praised God for him helping them on their journey. Not all of them were Adventists. Some definitely were. Some of them found Christianity on the journey. Some of them found Christianity in the Adventist church when they arrived in Italy, because they said, there's a community there that cares. And they do. And I met people, Italian people, people from Fiji, one particular lady from Fiji that used to go to church in Naples, and she came to Castle Volturno to help translate, because obviously you're a migrant straight into the country, you don't speak Italian. And I left at the end of that day so inspired with people that have gone on really difficult journeys. But God has done something with their lives. People who still don't know what the end of their journey is, but God has done something with their lives. God has made everything beautiful in its time. There are so many stories we could tell. You'll recognize this. This is another thing that totally astonishes me, that we told the story. And in fact, last time I came to preach in your church, which wasn't a church, it was a marquee over there. It was the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of World War I, and I'd done the research and learnt about our Adventist men who had stood firm for Christ, who had refused to break the Sabbath, who had refused to kill. It's astonishing that 100 years on, there's a memorial garden outside your church to those people. I really wish, and there's nobody from the British Union here this morning, but please tell them, can you please finish it? Because there are supposed to be texts, verses of peace around that wall. And I have people from the Peace Pledge Union, which is a secular pacifist organization. They wrote to me before Christmas and said, Victor, please, can you write an article for us, for our website, on why Seventh-day Adventists refuse to fight? We want to understand the theology of it. And I want to be able to say to them, here's the theology, and I've written the article and sent it to them, and did you know we've got a peace garden? Well, I've told them we've got a peace garden, but I want to be able to tell them there's a pile of Bible text there that helps explain. That's the end of my commercial. But it inspires me when I researched their story, and when I even discovered that my great-uncle was one of those that was harshly imprisoned in France. And I look at those men and the journey they went through, and then after the First World War, I see how, despite having been so badly treated, that they went out as missionaries to East Africa and West Africa, and G. Norris went down to South America. He started a health food factory here first, and then he went down to South America and built health food factories down there. And these men, they weren't destroyed by the bad experiences that happened to them. They still found that God could do real things in their lives in His time. And you read accounts, and I came across some more just recently when I was doing the research for the Peace Pledge Union article. Them writing years later about their experiences, and yet writing with positive language and with hope. I just find that inspires me. This last year, I'm kind of always looking for the big picture of what is the world looking at that we as communicators, as a church, have something to say. And last year, of course, was the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther supposedly at least nailing his 95 theses to the castle church door in Wittenberg. And so we worked on a series of social media programs that would help people understand what the Reformation was all about. And I was amazed again. I went to this village in the south of Italy to learn about the Waldenses. And you're saying immediately, those of you that are historians, why is he going to the south of Italy? Because the Waldenses were up in the north of Italy, in Switzerland and France and those areas, and they were. But there's a fascinating story of a group of them that moved from France down to the south of Italy to Guardia Piedmontese because the king in that area was willing to offer them protection. And we went down there and we interviewed one of their descendants, a lovely guy, didn't speak a word of English. It was very interesting. I would ask him the questions in English and he would reply in Italian, and somehow we managed to understand each other. We did have some Italians there to help us. But Fiorenzo, he was a direct descendant of these Waldenses, and he told a story of how they prospered down there for 250 years as they moved away from the persecution in France, and they were weavers, and in France they'd been weaving wool. In Italy, because of the trade with the East, they were weaving silk, and so they became quite wealthy. But then the Reformation got into full swing, and somehow the church became less tolerant of them, and there was a demand that they should be dealt with. And one night, or one afternoon, a group of 6 soldiers turned up at their walled village on the top of the mountain, beautiful setting, with some prisoners. And they said, "Can we imprison these prisoners in your tower overnight so that they will be secure?" Those prisoners were actually soldiers in disguise. And after sunset, the gates of that keep tower were opened, and 250 people were massacred because of their belief, and you can see their names in the village square there, of their belief that they wanted to be able to have the Bible in their own language. They wanted lay preachers to be able to preach that we can study the Bible together rather than we just take it from the priest and that is it, and several other things as well. But they gave their life for it. They had the beautiful, but they also struggled with other areas in their life, and that was difficult for them as well. I'd actually forgotten I'd put this video in here. This is just part of the program that we showed, and there's a series of 7 of them that talk about different areas of how the Reformation emphasized how important the Bible is to us. And we're going to go on another one where we're planning this April to go to up to Wales and tell the Mary Jones story of a little 15-year-old girl that walked barefoot 25 miles because she wanted a Bible. And these stories inspire me, and it's wonderful. Back to Ecclesiastes, he's made everything beautiful in his time. He's also set eternity in the human heart. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Difficult words, because we sit here, I'm not going to tell you any more difficult, challenging stories of things happening to people, but we sit here and we read our Bibles and we ask questions. If God is working his purpose out, if God is the only one who can know from the beginning from the end, why is it in this series on Eden that you're doing here, why is it that it took so long for God to move from Genesis 3:15 and say there will be somebody coming that's going to save you, and you have to go through all of the Old Testament, all of the promises and the exile and all the things that happen to his people until you eventually get down to Jesus and the New Testament? Equally, we can ask, why does it take so long from the book of Acts and looking up and saying, Jesus will come in like manner. So we're waiting today still for Jesus to come. Why has it taken so long? Or for Adventists in particular, because we call ourselves Seventh-day Adventists for a particular reason. And why is it that, it's now 2018, and in 1844, before we became a church, but, the forerunners to Adventists went through that great disappointment experience, but then studied their Bibles to say, yes, we understand. This is what's happening at the moment. We still need to prepare the world for Jesus to come again soon. And I was reading through one of the tribunal papers for these First World War Adventists. I've forgotten the man's name, but he was up in Wales at the top of the valleys there. He went to a tribunal, and the tribunal said, no, we refuse you. You need to go and fight. And so he appealed, and I read his appeal document. And in his appeal document, he says, I cannot go to fight because we are living in the last days. And he gave a whole pile of scripture passages, some of them really technical, that even me as a minister, I had to look them up and think, what's this about? But he was giving these to the tribunal judge, and he's saying, I can't go and fight because Jesus is coming in soon. And how can I be going and killing people when what I really need to be doing as a colporteur, selling Christian books, is going to doors and telling people that Jesus can make a difference in their lives? You can imagine the tribunal judge didn't take too kindly to that reasoning, and his appeal was refused. He had to go into a non-combatant force. The only thing, he had to serve in the army. He just didn't have to kill people. But that was his belief and his strong belief. And yet here we are in 2018, and we're still asking, God, when's it going to happen? We're looking at Grenfell Tower, and we're looking at Syria, and we're looking at so many different things, and we're thinking, God, how much longer? I was struck by something recently. My wife, unfortunately, has discovered Gumtree. And so I will come home from work, and she'll say to me, Victor, you've got to go to such and such a place and pick up this thing I've either got for free or just bought. And this happened, and she said, yeah, I've just bought some cupboards it used to be my office. It's turned into her craft room. And my books seem to somehow migrate from the office to the attic. But she's bought these cupboards for her craft materials. And said, Victor, we need to go and pick them up. And so we arranged on the Sunday to go and pick them up. And it was in Slough, so it's only 9 miles from our house. Big, beautiful cupboard. She'd actually got a good deal. We just paid £30 for these beautiful cupboards that if you bought them new would probably be £700 or £800. And they look nice in our office. But I went to pick them up, or we went to pick them up because they were heavy. We took, even the two of us together, it was a job picking them up and getting them on the roof rack and in the car. But I took a wrong turning on the way out from getting these cupboards from Gumtree. And in Slough, I discovered this church. And I've got to tell you, I really like it. Because can you see Jesus up there? Let me bring it in closer. That's not the Jesus you normally see on a church, is it? That's not the Jesus that you see when you go around. I mean, there's Jesus, the top right. That's Jesus in Portugal with his hands over Lisbon, blessing the city. Or down in the bottom right, you've got the more orthodox icons of Jesus. Or you go into churches and you see the wounded Jesus hanging in pain on the cross. And the kind of theology is a theology of pain and suffering. And yet, you go to this church in Slough, and you have the jumping Jesus, the happy Jesus, the running Jesus. And it's really interesting. I did some research. Actually, I wrote to the church and commended them for their jumping Jesus. They call him the running man. But this Jesus was actually designed by a sixth form engineering student. And it was made, and that to me makes a statement. This is a church that empowers its young people. And it gives a message. The suffering Christ is important. The Christ that died on a cross is vitally important. That whole story of the Passion, very significant. But if the story stops there, we're only getting half the story. There's also a Jesus that rose again. There's a happy Jesus. There's a positive Jesus. You know what distresses me as an Adventist the most? Is the number of miserable Adventists there. Not in Stanborough Park Church. But sometimes you go on social media or you read some magazine and you think, is that person really an Adventist? They're such a miserable old soul. You know, doesn't Jesus, when you understand him properly, doesn't he bring joy into your life? Doesn't he really give you a hope and a vision that, you know, if you go back to Ecclesiastes and there's a time for this and a time for that, that God is there with us in the difficult times. He's there with us in the prison. He's there with us on a leaking boat that's sinking in the middle of the Mediterranean. But he's there with a purpose that leads us towards something good. And that Jesus there on that church really says something to me. He has made everything beautiful in his time. He's also set eternity in the human heart. That eternity comes from the resurrection. Yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. Well, there's still a lot to learn. You look at that running man there, and you think, still questions to ask. Why did it take 3 days for God, for Jesus to be there in the tomb? Why couldn't he just die and do the big leap up the next morning? Why did Jesus direct the disciples from Jerusalem to go up to Galilee? And I'll meet you there. And you read that story in John 21. We don't have time to read it today. But you find, because Jesus doesn't appear, that they go out fishing and fish all night and get nothing. And then the next morning, they find Jesus has got the fish ready for them on the beach. He's got a barbecue breakfast for them. And their sorrow turns into the running, happy jumping. And they can have their commission. They've got the hope. They can go and feed my sheep. They can go and make disciples of all nations. So many of those stories. And Peter even says and we often quote him from 2 Peter 3 verse 8, "But beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day with the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day." And we often say that passage is there. That's because Jesus didn't come in 2017. But maybe it's 2018. But I think what Peter's really saying is God made everything beautiful in his time. Live for the moment of where you are now. There are questions we still have to ask. There are difficulties we're going through in our lives. And yet God is doing something. As I said to you, I was kind of surprised to end up working in this building. This is just for any of you that haven't driven 5 miles up the road to St. Albans. I can see Jim Huzzy looking at it and thinking, praise the Lord, I've retired. But that's where I work. And try and share communication skills across 22 countries. And some of them very secular countries. Some of them very orthodox countries. 2 of them very Islamic-orientated countries. Somehow we have to share Jesus with them. And it's not easy. And even in Watford, it's not easy, but you're doing some good things here. But it draws me back to why we are here as a Seventh-day Adventist church. And we have our mission statements. I don't know whether it's on your wall anywhere in this church, but this is the official mission statement of the Adventist Church, to proclaim to all peoples, including the people of Watford, the everlasting gospel of God's love in the context of the three angels' messages, and so on. You can read the rest of the statement there. But to summarize that statement is basically saying, there is an everlasting gospel to proclaim. We need to preach it. We need to share. That's part of our message. It's also pointing out that there's a lot that's not good in the world. Babylon has fallen. There's false worship. And we have to take that seriously. If anyone worships the beast and receives its mark, they shall drink of the wrath of God, the cup of the wrath of God. And that leaves us in tension. One last story for you, if that is all right. In our filming for the Reformation Journey series, we spent a couple of days in Rome, and being good Adventist pastors, Dejan Stojkovic and I went to the Jesuit church, the Church of Ignatius Loyola. Wow. You go in that church, it is amazing. The most amazing thing is that you go to a back corner on the left-hand side of the altar, and you find Loyola himself towering up, a massive, high statue, and he is standing there with an open Bible, because as the founder of the Jesuits, he's presenting you with truth. But do you see who's down at his feet there? Loyola has actually got his foot on Martin Luther. And Martin Luther has got a closed Bible, because Martin Luther does not know the truth. Martin Luther has got snakes crawling around him, because he is spreading wrong teachings. And you walk into that church and you think, wow, 500 years after the Reformation started, and there's that statue, there's also a painting in there that points out that we've still got a journey to make. And how do we deal with it as Adventists? I was very interested in the way the Adventist Church in Italy has dealt with it. Together with the evangelicals and the Lutherans, they spent 8 years working with Rome City Council to get a square, a little plaza, right near the Colosseum. If you've ever been to the Colosseum, look behind you, there's a park, and you just walk up through that park. You might even be walking to the Vatican, because it's part of the routes that you would do to get there, and you have the Piazza Martin Luther. It's a very small square. The fountain in it doesn't even work properly. But after 8 years, in time for the 500th anniversary celebrations, you have the Loyola Church about 3 kilometers away saying Martin Luther is a heretic, and you have a square a couple of kilometers from the Vatican celebrating that here is a theologian, the founder of the Reformation, and we honor him. Now, there were lots of people that came to that opening when the square opened. I have to confess there were no priests amongst them, but there were a lot of other people there. The mayor was there. It was a significant celebration. But as God is making everything beautiful in his time, we have to reflect now in 2018 with the knowledge that we have. How do we share not a negative message of attacking those that think differently to us, but a positive message of this is the way we're moving forward? You know, Deanne and I were quite amazed when we came out of our hotel, which is actually very close to the Vatican, that we saw some graffiti on the wall. That's Deanne taking the photo. I don't know if you can read that graffiti. It was in English. I don't know why. Why wasn't it in Italian? You'd never get that on a wall in Watford. Burn your local heretics. We don't even know who the heretics were. It might have been a Protestant putting it up there against what they see as the Antichrist. It may have been Some Catholics putting it there saying, why are these Protestants getting so much in our city? But what really amazed me was not so much this sign, burn your local heretics, but in the same kind of writing, a few meters along the wall, it says, Jesus Christ lives. What kind of Christian puts burn your local heretics, but Jesus Christ lives? And what kind of Adventist am I in sharing the beautiful message that we have in the Bible, sharing the character of God that we've discovered in the Bible, not knowing all the answers, not knowing all the truths, but discovering enough to share the beauty, to share the mission. I was very, very reticent to move from the British Union, where I was working as communication director, to go up to the division, because I was thinking, I'm English and I'm a pastor, and there are something like 70 million people in the British Union, many of whom don't know Jesus and still need him. And I thought, I'm doing what I need to do here to share Jesus. But Pastor Rafat is a very persuasive man and would not take no for an answer. And I blame Audrey as well. She's sitting there smiling. And I moved there and I discovered 22 countries that need Jesus, that need to know that it's not about heretics, it's about the love of God. It's about God changing lives. It's about a special relationship with God. And from that 16-year-old boy that got baptized somewhere around here, it may have moved back or forth slightly, somewhere on this platform I was baptized by Pastor Surridge, to where I am today. I've moved in my journey, and I've discovered that really the most important thing for me is that relationship with God. It's to know God. Yes, knowing the 28 fundamentals is important, but those fundamentals are basically telling me more about God. Those fundamentals aren't defining that I'm a saint and he's a sinner. It's probably the other way around. They're just saying this is a way to understand God better. And when I leave this church this morning and I go back to my house and I see my neighbors, it's not my job to say to them, I went to church this morning while you went shopping. My job is to build relationship, to let them know that there's a beautiful God there and that we're on a journey together, and that in his time he makes all things beautiful. And even if things aren't beautiful at the moment, and there are challenges, we can make the choices and we can say, God, yes, you are the one for my life. You are the one I want to go forward with. And my neighbor, whether my neighbor is in Bracknell or in Watford or in Lithuania or in Greece or anywhere else, my neighbor needs to know that same message of joy, that God makes everything beautiful.